Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I'd like to speak about various new releases which have been released both over the past few weeks, but also a couple of them which were some unsung beauties from Baselworld. And so as a result today in this May 2018 new releases video, I'd like to pick up on the various releases I've missed, and talk about some very interesting pieces, varying from reinterpretations of past styles to genuine re-editions of vintage timepieces. Now this first watch I'd like to speak about is the Christopher Ward C65 Diver, which is a watch which was only released a few days ago now. And it's quite an interesting model, because it bridges the gap between Christopher Ward's models in their range of C60 Trident vintage models, which are 38mm watches, which don't have a dive bezel but rather still have 150m water resistance, and their full 600m Trident. And so this model has the 150m water resistance, but does have a wider case at 41mm and a thickness of 11.55mm. But the design of this watch is really designed to be in keeping with older styles, in terms of proportions, but taking into account modern preferences for design, and also modern technical abilities. Now the watch is 150m water resistant, as I've said, and features a beautiful level of fasting, polishing and brushing on its stainless steel case, with a variety of different edges, as you can see, with brushing on the top of the lugs, and then polished bevels running down the edge, with a large, exposed and unprotected Christopher Ward crown, which actually overlaps with the bezel, which is quite an interesting touch, and has a very deeply signed Christopher Ward logo. And I think the crown is something which really was needed on this watch, to provide a certain balance to the watch, and something a little bit more accentuated than simply a small crown in keeping with the rest of the case. The bezel on this watch is an extremely interesting aspect, because it features this very slender insert, and a beautiful but rather delicate coin edge. And as that is the case, this bezel won't be nearly as easy to access or use as a very thick and large bezel as seen on their full Trident 600m diver. However, I feel this watch fulfills a very different purpose. This is a watch which you can enjoy under a sleeve or a cuff with no real trouble because of its smooth edges and its low sides, and for someone who wants something a little bit more dressy. However, it does still retain a certain water resistance and a certain resistance to the elements, which is nowhere near a professional dive watch, but does still provide a fair amount of aquatic ability and a usability as far as a dive watch goes. And the bezel, as you can see, is this very low and very narrow aluminium bezel insert, which is fully graduated to Christopher Ward's credit, and is luminescent at 12 o'clock, which I think is something that I'm pleased to see them add, because a lot of these very thin bezels don't feature that loomed pip, which I think is something of a loss. Now the proportions of this watch are rather curious, because it features a 41mm case, but which is uncharacteristic for a watch with such a fine bezel, and as a result this gives the watch an extremely large dial area in relation to its case size, which is quite an interesting touch and does provide the watch with a unique look. The dial comes in two variants, as does the bezel, which is black or blue, both of these matte colours, with a use of numerals at 12 and 6, with the Christopher Ward logo on the left-hand side of the dial. They are no-date models as well, and feature very minimal dial text, with an embossed and very attractively done, but somewhat simple Christopher Ward logo at 12 o'clock. Then one has full graduations around the edge of the dial, and the hands are these brilliantly faceted baton-style hands, which work very well with the design, and that Trident logo is still retained on the counterweight of the second hand. One somewhat divisive aspect of this watch is the Sleater SW210 movement. And this isn't because it's a Sleater or an ETA or any of this sort of discussion, because I don't think there's anything really to be said in that regard. But it's because this watch is manually wound rather than being automatic, yet remains a dive watch. And it's often said that dive watches should be automatic to minimise the amount of use the crown gets. However, with modern seals and the fact that this watch isn't designed to be a professional dive watch, but rather a watch which can be used as a dive watch when needed, but will most likely spend most of its time out of water, I can understand why they would have incorporated this into the watch, just to make it slimmer. And the watch is 11.55mm thick, so it's not particularly thin. However, a lot of that height is added on by that heavily domed crystal, which is of course sapphire, and provides a wonderful view into the watch. And so as a result, I think the 3.35mm thick movement is justified in this regard, and I can certainly see the use of that large crown being particularly appealing, in terms of being able to really get involved with one's watch. The sales price for this watch is £695, which in my eyes makes it an extremely good deal in terms of offering something completely different for a collector, or simply someone who rather fancies a more dressy dive watch. And I have no doubts, bearing in mind Christopher Ward's track record, that this watch will be of extremely good quality, be very reliable, and really very well made, which is great to see, and I think something perfect for a collector or indeed a simply enjoyer of watches who want something different in a collection but still expect good quality and a Swiss-made build. The second watch I'd like to speak about is quite an interesting piece called the Mido Commander Shade. And this 37mm dress watch is a very, very curious piece on the market, and just as the Christopher Ward is fairly different, and one could even argue unique in its segment, this watch truly is unique. And the Mido Commander is an interesting model because it's been produced continually since 1959 when it was first introduced, and provides the owner in this format with a very, very interesting 70s design, which I think actually will become rather timeless and is already extremely elegant. The circular case of this watch in polished stainless steel is 37mm in diameter, and without lugs this may well wear extremely small for some wrists, and so as a result it's probably worthwhile trying this watch on before buying. However, what I have found is that really buying a watch, one should simply choose the size which fits best, so really it's worth simply considering. But the case of this watch is quite curious because it's very, very different with this circular profile and these polished bezels. To match that polished stainless steel case is a polished stainless steel Milanese bracelet. This is integrated into the case, as you can see, and fits with the design of this watch extremely well as that text, to provide an air of the 1950s in this 1970s sort of design. Likewise, the bracelet tapers somewhat to account for that curve of the case and continue the elegant forms and lines seen in this watch. The dial of the watch really is a beautiful affair, with this wonderful fume style from grey to a deep, almost black anthracite sort of colour, which gives this spotlight effect on the front of the dial and highlights those hands beautifully, which have that silver and black form, which is again mirrored in those beautifully faceted indices which run around the edge of the dial. On the dial we also have Mido and Commander applied in this fantastic old-fashioned of text, which I think works very, very well with the form of the case and brings the whole design together without being too obtrusive. Then there is the large windowed and well-windowed, in fact, date window, which is provided courtesy of an ETA 2836, which gives that day-date complication a very reliable movement as well, and a general build which should be very, very usable for long periods of time. And of course the case is a monoblock case, so you can't open it through the case back, rather you have to remove the crystal. And so this watch celebrating the 100th anniversary of the brand, with a really beautiful domed crystal, and this magnificent design which really is unique on the market. The price is $870 which I don't think is by any means unreasonable in terms of providing an attractive dress watch of this form, which admittedly doesn't have very much in the way of new technology, but rather does provide a brilliant design which will fit into any collection extremely well. The next watch I'd like to speak about is an interesting model from IWC. And the reason why I say this is because not that long ago IWC produced a re-edition of their Mark 11 style pilot's watch with those iconic hands and of course that very particular style of dial which has epitomised the technical field of pilot's watches really for an extremely long time. And they've struck again with these remakes, and these aren't exactly vintage watches per se, but rather simply remakes of an iconic design. And they follow in the footsteps of the reference 3706, the Fliegerchronograph, which has become so iconic in terms of being a pilot's chronograph, with nothing superfluous. And of course these themselves take inspiration from the hands and dial design of the Mark 11. So one can view this watch as a successor to this style, with the greatest reliability and functionality possible. And whilst these days IWC are very much a luxury brand, I do always enjoy seeing these watches harking back to earlier days, when IWC was very much known for their sporting and technical watches. And this watch is about as close to those technical watches as one can get. And the case has grown to 43mm by 15.3mm, which is by no means small, but perfectly suitable for this large pilot's technical watch. Of course, IWC chronographs and pilot's watches in general have taken on this very particular design, which one could argue is almost as recognisable as something like a Rolex Oyster case. And this is seen in the way that they use the brushing on their watches to provide a very simple design with a utilitarian but highly attractive and appealing form. Likewise, the sides of the case are also brushed, as well as those easily pushed and accessed pushers, which are of course polished, matching those polished bezels, which provide a glimmer of luxury to these watches, which of course remain at the heart of these timepieces in terms of the quality of manufacturing. The dial of this watch is utterly timeless in its format, in this matte black finish with simply IWC Schaffhausen on it with Swiss made on it. The dial is this matte black, which I think forms the most legible of bases for a dial, and is exactly in keeping with IWC's older pilot's watches, and as a result is exactly the colour I would have expected on this timepiece. The numerals run around the edge of the dial and again are marked in the most legible of font, which can be read almost immediately, with a large legible luminescent triangle at 12 o'clock, and luminescent rectangles at each quadrant of the dial, and then again on the hands. Now, the edge of the dial is also very, very well graduated, with these individual small streaks between the seconds to allow you to have a certain degree of extra legibility when it comes to the chronograph. And of course, bear in mind this watch is designed to be a pilot's chronograph, it must be legible quickly and easily. Then of course there is the clarity with which this dial is printed, which is very, very evident, whereby the dial hasn't got anything that would clutter it, such as additional scales, which simply wouldn't have been any of any use on this timepiece. The subdials are beautifully done as well, with these concentrically sunburst patterned subdials on those three sections, again with very, very legible printing and white hands. Beating inside this watch is the IWC caliber 79320, which is a movement which has been used by quite a few models in the IWC range, and is an extremely well modified in terms of decoration and finishing, and also regulation version of the Veligere 7750, which is an extremely reliable and very, very well-known chronograph movement of the integrated kind, which means that it has the chronograph and the automatic movement and timekeeping mounted into a single unit, rather than being a modular design, by having the lower mounting and rest of the movement running the time, with a further module placed on the top, which can have certain difficulties in terms of reliability, but furthermore in terms of the difficulty in terms of servicing. And so as a result, I tend to like this Veligere arrangement, because it is just so unbelievably reliable with its cam-operated chronograph. And so presented on this very, very well-made green NATO strap, we see a timepiece which presents a very different facet to IWC than the conventional side we see these days. And it shows a utilitarian, well-built, and extremely reliable pilot's chronograph, which has timeless design, and a form which will look just as crisp and clean in the future as it does today, and as it did 20 years ago. And the price for this watch is $4,950 US, which admittedly is more than other brands which also produce very, very high quality professional pilots' chronographs, which like this watch are also negative pressure resistant. However, for those who do particularly want one of these styles of older IWCs, this may well make an extremely interesting option if you want something reliable in the modern sense, and indeed built in a modern way, but with those same aesthetics. Now, the following watch is a very, very interesting piece in my opinion, because it stretches the newly formed JLC Polaris line to its very limits. And this is the Polaris Geographic World Time Limited Edition. And this is a limited edition of 250 pieces, but provides a very, very interesting device in terms of giving you as much legibility whilst having as many complications as possible. And of course the Polaris line is based on these models with the highly legible hands and dials, and we see echoes of this seen on the dial of this watch with those pointed pieces of luminova within those beautifully polished applied indices. And then of course one has the 12, 3 and 9 placed around the dial, but of course cut off by the various subdials. And the design of this watch should be extremely cluttered, but it's extremely well executed. And the watch itself is 42mm by a staggeringly thin, actually, for this amount of complications, 11.54mm. The watch also remains 100 meters water resistant, again fulfilling its criteria as far as being a robust and genuinely wearable sports watch. The dial of the watch again appears rather cluttered, but features this beautiful smoky matte dial in this highly coarse type of matting on its surface, which enables it to take on that soft aesthetic which I think works so well with this timepiece, and contrasts the applied JLC logo and the Jaeger-LeCoultre markings on the top of the dial very, very well. Then in terms of complications, one really does have a great deal, because the movement caliber 936A/1 is a 43-hour power reserve automatic movement, which, like the master controls, is tested for 1,000 hours before sale, which is again a rather remarkable feat for these watches to be available with. Of course, in the centre of the dial one has the hands for the hours, the minutes and the seconds, but it's what's seen around these that's interesting. because despite these hands being beautifully faceted and extremely well made, the various other subdials do show the wonders of this movement. And so really at about 2 o'clock one sees the pointer date, which of course is quite crucial in terms of being able to use it as a traveller. But then one has a power reserve indicator on the left-hand side of the dial as well, in a contrasting style. Then at 6 o'clock one has a smaller dial with the hours and the minutes on it, and what this is a second time zone entirely to be displayed here, so you can keep track of home and away time. But the world timer is seen on those rings around the edge of the dial, and these can be rotated depending upon where you are in order to be able to have that second time zone on that particular area. And interestingly, one has a small asterisk next to each of the cities around the ring which runs the world timer, which operate with a summertime. And so this enables you to have the marker for that location shifted by an hour in order to show its summertime rather than simply its standard time. And with this watch one really is able to witness the care that JLC take with their timepieces. And I think JLC is a brand which sadly is often overlooked in the luxury watch industry, where people simply go for Audemars Piguet, for Rolex, for Omega. But I think this is a brand which has a heck of a lot to offer. And in this case we see a watch which is beautifully manufactured, with a very, very high level of finishing on the case and also on the hands and dial, with a watch which would very easily have become cluttered and not terribly legible, remain extremely easy to use and beautiful in its design, which is difficult to create an elegant timepiece with this level of complication. Now it's unsurprising that the movement of this watch is a beautiful piece, bearing in mind that Jaeger-LeCoultre have made movements for all of the big three of Swiss watchmaking, having made movements for Patek Philippe, Vacheron-Constantin, and indeed Audemars Piguet. And through the caliber 920, which by the way is one of my favourite calibers of all time in terms of being an ultra-slim automatic movement used by all three of these brands, JLC is certainly extremely well versed in producing beautiful movements of extremely high quality, and this watch is no exception. This piece is of course a 1,000-hour control movement, so it's been tested for 1,000 hours before sale to ensure it's running within its particular parameters and to an extremely high level. Then of course one has the beautiful cut and engraved JLC rotor, which again features their logo and creates an aesthetic of such care and delicate beauty, which is mirrored in the striping on the movement as well as the blued screws, creating an exhibition caseback which really does show the best of watchmaking. Now the price of this watch is of course rather high at €13,650, but knowing JLC's history and the beauty and delicate nature of their products in terms of the finishing and the sheer quality of their movements, I think that JLC are certainly a brand which I respect enormously and which I like for their design, their innovation and their consistent good quality. The final watch I'd like to speak about, I'm really speaking about because I think it's a wonderful looking watch and it's an excuse to show on the channel. And the numbers in which this watch is going to be made really don't make it viable as far as a buying option for the vast majority of us. However, I do think it's an interesting piece to talk about because it shows a very interesting design, which I think is a timeless design of the Heuer Carrera. And this is a replica of the watch that Jack Heuer gave to Ronnie Peterson, this famous 70s Swedish racing driver, and it was the reference 1158, the original. And the original watch was one of these extremely rare solid gold Carreras. And these watches, they estimate, were made in less than 500 examples, whilst a similar watch was given to his teammate, who of course was Mario Andretti. Now the original version of this watch was in fact recently sold for 225,000 Swiss francs. But it's a very interesting watch in terms of having that beautiful Milanese bracelet on the 38mm Carrera case, which couldn't be mistaken for anything else really, and does show that era of motor racing very, very well. Now the modern version comes in two variants, with a gold version which is limited to only 2 pieces, only one of which is going to be sold, which will be sold at Bonham's on the 11th of May. And then there's the steel version which is limited to only 40 pieces and will be sold exclusively in Sweden, the origin and the birthplace of Ronnie Peterson. This watch remains very, very faithful to the original, with a 38mm case, which of course is rather short as well due to those short and stubby lugs. But also, it by contrast to the original, features a caliber 11, which is the modern version of Heuer's movements, which uses Solita base with a Dubois de Pras module mounted to the top to give that bicompax layout with the date at 6 o'clock, and of course the crown on the opposite side of the case. And the original featured what was called the caliber 12, which was an evolution of their famous caliber 11, which was also modular, so this watch is in a sense quite true to the original concept. But then one comes to the design of the dial, which continues to have those beautiful applied indices and that striping, which appears more subdued on the steel version thanks to the silver colour. To pay homage to the original, the caseback is embossed with success from Jack Heuer to Ronnie Peterson, which I think is a very nice touch, and one which just adds a little bit to this watch, which will of course, being a unique piece, most likely not be seen for a while on the market, but makes for a very interesting talking piece in terms of simply discussing this watch and its remake of a classic design in a modern form. Though of course I really would like to see a production form of these styles of watches, because they do look absolutely wonderful with that striped dial, the Heuer logo, which is infinitely cooler than the Tag Heuer logo, thanks to its clean aesthetic, which I think has become synonymous with racing, and of course that bicompax layout and the integrated tachymeter on the chapter ring around the inside of the dial. Of course I can't give a price for this watch as a result of the fact that it's going up for auction. However, the version which is being produced in steel in 40 pieces is to be sold for approximately $10,500, which is, one could argue, quite a lot for a Dubois de Pras module movement. But then in these limited runs and with this degree of quality, and the fact these watches are so individual, I can certainly see why a collector would want to get hold of one of these. And so I'll conclude this video here, which indeed included far more vintage-inspired watches than I'd expected, but I suppose that such are the times at the moment. And do tell me in the comments down below which ones you found interesting, and which ones left a bit to be desired. And if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and to be able to enjoy more content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armand the Watch Guy, out.